ways, more hidden ways in causing rulers to make decisions that he wants them to make. God promised that he would use the Persian king Cyrus as his agent to bring about the return of the Jewish exiles to Jerusalem. And Cyrus encouraged the Jews to return, and he also allowed them to raise funds for the project they were going to undertake once they got back. He gave them the temple utensils that Nebuchadnezzar had stolen some decades before. And Cyrus hoped that if these utensils were returned to Jerusalem, then the God of Israel would intercede with his gods on his behalf. Well, Ezra wanted his audience to value temple worship, and he wanted them to appreciate the effort that went into this building of the temple, because he's writing this some decades after the events actually occur. So his audience there, he wants to make sure that they keep up the worship and they appreciate what went into bringing back the temple. In the second chapter, we saw that there was a lot of names that were listed there of the people that returned. Some were listed by their clan or family group. Others were listed by the city from which they came. And these names we found are difficult to pronounce and unrecognizable to us, but we saw that God was fulfilling his promise even through this list. The list maintains the historical record of God's people. And God cared for his people enough to call them by name, and we know that he cares for us in that same way. Well, last week we studied how the Jews carried a huge treasure with them on this 900-mile journey they made from Babylon back to Jerusalem. And when they arrived in Jerusalem, they brought this gold and silver to the priests as a free will offering. It would be used in rebuilding the temple. They also brought the priestly garments that would be used by the priests in preparation for worship. So the first thing they did was they rebuilt the altar. This demonstrated that their hearts were in the right place. Worship for them began with confession and sacrifice, so they wanted to have the altar in place. And then we saw at the end of the chapter, at the end of our section last week, that the Jews hired laborers to do the building. They purchased the materials for the construction project. They sent off to Lebanon to get some cedars that were cut down and brought up to the sea and floated down to Joppa and then carried inland to Jerusalem. So they arranged for all that to be transported and for the work to begin. Well, tonight we're going to read that the returning exiles rebuilt the temple foundations. So we'll take a look at verses 8 through 13. And again, if you would jot down any important words there, we'll use that for an overview for the evening. All right, Ezra 3, beginning in verse 8. Now in the second year after their coming to the house of God at Jerusalem, in the second month, Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and Jeshua the son of Jozadak made a beginning, together with the rest of their kinsmen, the priests and the Levites, and all who had come to Jerusalem from the captivity. They appointed the Levites from 20 years old and upward to supervise the work of the house of the Lord. And Jeshua with his sons and his brothers, and Kadmiel and his sons, the sons of Judah, together supervised the workmen in the house of God, along with the sons of Henadad and the Levites and their sons and brothers. And when the builders laid the foundation of the temple of Yahweh, the priests in their vestments came forward with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, to praise Yahweh, according to the directions of David, king of Israel. And they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to Yahweh. For he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever toward Israel. And all the people shouted with a great shout when they praised Yahweh, because the foundation of the house of Yahweh was laid. But many of the priests and Levites and heads of fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first house, wept with a loud voice when they saw the foundation of this house being laid, though many shouted aloud for joy, so that the people could not distinguish the sound of the joyful shout from the sound of the people's weeping. For the people shouted with a great shout, and the sound was heard far away. Okay, what What words stood out to you there describing this chapter?
Because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid.
Shouting and weeping.
Yep.
Together, they come together to do this, choose leadership and do it properly.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, good. Well, we're gonna be talking about all those things. That's a good beginning here. Well, as we said last week, the exiles put a priority on worship and worshiping the right way. They were careful to rebuild the altar on its previous site. They mimicked the footprint of the previous altar, which was in the outer courtyard of the temple. So completing the altar allowed them to begin sacrifices, which they did right away. This was a central part of their worship of Yahweh as recorded by Moses. Well, the sacrifice was always to be a whole offering. It was completely consumed in the flames before their eyes. Those offering the sacrifice could see before them a representation of the perfect sacrifice. It was death of the sacrifice, but even more than that, the sacrifice was consumed, demonstrating total and unreserved surrender to God. This is what Jesus demonstrated as he submitted to the cross, and it is what God calls us to do today. We read that in Romans 12, 1 and 2.
Therefore, I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, which is good and acceptable and perfect.
Well, we see in verse 8 that this is happening in the second year after their return. So there's a gap between verses 7 and 8 in this chapter. Verse 8 moves us into the second month of the second year after their return from Babylon. And this really makes a lot of sense, right? It would have taken some time for their cedar order to be processed, if you will, right? They had to get the word to Lebanon. The guys had to go cut the wood, had to be shipped to them and carried overland. So that was going to take some time. And as we noted last week, we see some similarities between the building of Solomon's temple and this reconstruction. They purchased cedars from Lebanon, just as Solomon did, and they paid for them in the same way that Solomon paid for them. They paid for them in kind, if you remember. There was drink and food and oil that they used to buy the cedar. And also, I think another thing that wasn't missed by them is they're starting in the same month that Solomon began his work on the temple. We see this in 2 Chronicles 3, 1 and 2.
Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to David, his father, at the place where David had appointed on the threshing floor of Ornan, the Jebusite. He began to build in the second month of the fourth year of his reign.
So a lot of similarities here between these two projects. Well, here again, Zerubbabel and Joshua are leading the effort as they led the journey over and they led in the rebuilding of the altar. Here they're leading this effort to rebuild the temple. Joshua has the priests and Levites with him, and Zerubbabel has his kinsmen with him. And it says that this building effort included everyone who came to Jerusalem from captivity. Well, last week we read that they gathered together as one man to rebuild the altar. So they were of one mind and one single purpose in building the altar. And now we see that everyone is again united in the task that is before them in rebuilding the temple. Well, verse 8 goes on to say, they appointed the Levites from 20 years old and upward to supervise the work of the house of the Lord. The Levites continue to be mentioned in Ezra because they are involved in temple worship. But let's take a few minutes and kind of refresh our memories about the history of the Levites. The founder and the namesake of the Levites was Levi. He was Jacob's third son. He was born to Leah. All three of those first sons were born to Leah. Reuben was the oldest, Simeon was the second oldest, and then came Levi. Well, Jacob and his 12 sons came to dwell in the land of Shechem. And the land of Shechem, let me see if I can circle this for you on the map, and then I'll enlarge it here. So the area of Shechem sits in this valley between Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, and we'll remember those from our studies in the Kings and a lot of Old Testament history taking place in there. So that's where it lies there, north of Jerusalem in that valley. Well, the prince of that land was a man named Hamor, and he had a son who was named Shechem, just like the town was named Shechem. And in Genesis 34, we read that Shechem lusted after Jacob's daughter, Dinah. She was the full sister of Simeon and Levi. Well, Shechem took Dinah and defiled her. Hamor then approached Jacob and asked that he give Dinah to Shechem in marriage because Shechem loved her. Hamor also proposed that their clans could then intermarry going forward, and they could do a lot of trading, and it could be a great dynasty they could build together. He would give Jacob whatever he wanted as a bride price for Dinah. Well, Simeon and Levi saw this arrangement, and they saw an opportunity to get revenge against Shechem and his people. So Simeon and Levi tricked Shechem because Shechem loved Dinah very much, and he would have done anything to get her as his wife. They told him that he could marry Dinah, but only if he and all the men of the city would be circumcised. Well, Shechem must have been a pretty persuasive guy because he got all of his men in the city to agree to it. And while they were recovering from that circumcision, Simeon and Levi take up their swords and they kill all the males in the town, including Shechem and his father. It was angry, it was bloodthirsty, it was a cruel act that they undertook there. And here's one artist's rendition of Jacob's son Simeon and Levi killing the men of Shechem. Let me expand this for you a little bit here. Somebody there's getting beheaded. I mean, it's pretty ugly scene. Well, at the end of his life, largely as a result of this incident of revenge for their sister Dinah, Jacob gave a blessing to all of his children. But when he comes to bless Levi and Simeon, he lumps them together in one blessing. And really, when we read it, it reads a lot more like a curse than a blessing. Somebody has Genesis 49, 5 through 7.
Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. Let my soul come not into their counsel, O my glory, be not joined to their company. For in their anger they killed men, and in their willfulness they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel.
So he said he's going to scatter them in Israel, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But even after all this, God still extends his grace to the descendants of Levi. He gave them another chance. And in response, they demonstrated their loyalty to God when they stood up with Moses. If you remember, when Moses was on the mountain receiving the tablets of stone that contained the Ten Commandments, the Israelites were down there in the valley making a golden calf and worshiping the golden calf. Well, when Moses came down from the mountain, he was angry with the people. He called out for any who would stand with him on the Lord's side. And indeed, that did happen. We see that in Exodus 32, 26 to 29.
And Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, "Who is on the Lord's side? Come to me." And all the sons of Levi gathered around him. And he said to them, "Thus says the Lord of Israel, put your sword on your side, each of you, and go to and fro, from the gate to gate, throughout the camp, and each of you kill his brother and his companion and his neighbor." And the sons of Levi did according to the word of Moses. And that day, about 3,000 men of the people fell. And Moses said, "Today you have been ordained for the service of the Lord, each one at the cost of his son and of his brother, so that he might bestow a blessing upon you this very day."
So the people are out there sitting, building a golden calf, worshiping that golden calf. Moses comes down and he says, "Will anybody stand with me on the Lord's side?" And the Levites step up. "Yes, we will." And so they stood with Moses against all this sin that was going on and executed judgment then. And it's interesting because there it says, that day they were ordained to serve the Lord. Well, God commanded the Israelites as they're coming out of Egypt that all the firstborn of the males, all the firstborn males of humans and animals would belong to him. We read this in Exodus 13, verse 2.
"Consecrate to me all the firstborn, whatever is the first to open the womb among the people of Israel, with man and of beast is mine."
This was to be done in remembrance of their delivery out of Egypt, where every firstborn was killed in that final plague. The Israelites then were to bring their firstborn of their animals to sacrifice to God. But God said that he would take the Levites as the firstborn so that every family throughout Israel didn't have to offer up their firstborn to the Lord. But God said, "I'm going to take the Levites. They will be the firstborn. They will be dedicated to me." We see that in Numbers 3:11 to 13.
And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Behold, I am taking the Levites from among the people of Israel, instead of every firstborn who was in the womb of the people of Israel. The Levites shall be mine, for all the firstborn are mine. On the day that I struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, I consecrated for my own all the firstborn in Israel, both of man and of beast. They shall be mine, I am the Lord."
So God says they're going to be his. He's taking them as the firstborn. He's going to use them in temple service. We also see them later on. They're going to occupy some of these cities of refuge as well. So at this point then, the Levites have responsibilities in the tabernacle and later in the temple to serve God. Aaron was of the tribe of Levi. His descendants were tasked with caring for, packing up, and moving the tabernacle as the people wandered in the wilderness. They also became the residents in these cities of refuge. And if you recall, those cities of refuge were places where people could go to flee and get asylum if they had committed an accidental manslaughter. They could flee to a city of refuge and be safe there. Well, that's where the Levites lived. Later, the Levites served in the temple, in temple worship after the Solomon's temple was built. Well, we think of Levites as the tribe designated to serve God in the temple and tabernacle, and they were. But there's a lot more to this story as we've kind of done a quick overview of the Levites. We can see that this unrestrained anger is the cause of a great deal of sin. And if we turn on the news today, you see a lot of very angry people. And I don't see many of them that really are offering any good solutions. They just have a lot of hatred and anger. Anger leaves devastation in its wake, and sometimes there are irreparable consequences. Jacob said he would not enter their council or meeting place with the likes of Simeon and Levi. That was part of that curse that he gave to them as he was dying. He wanted no part of their anger or their cruelty. He didn't want to reason with them or even be associated with them. So when anger is a defining trait, it's an indication that we're lacking the spiritual gift of self-control. And Galatians 5 reminds us of that.
But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law.
So those are the things that we want to be pursuing rather than anger and revenge. Well, even more importantly, we see in the story of the tribe of Levi that sinners can be restored to the privileged position of children of God. They went from recipients of Jacob's curse as a result of their cruelty and anger to leaders of worship in the nation. We too have experienced God's restoration. Christ interceded for us that we may exchange our sin for righteousness. Paul talks about this in 2 Corinthians 5:21.
He made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him.
We become the righteousness of God. But in fact, Peter says we take on the role of the Levites as royal priests in service to God. 1 Peter 2:9.
But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light.
Well, after that brief overview of the Levites and their history and where they came from and how they came to the position they're in, let's head back into Ezra. We see that Levites that were 20 years old and older were selected to supervise the work that's about to begin. The law of Moses originally commanded that Levites would begin their service at 30 years of age. And we see this in Numbers 4, verses 1 through 4.
The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, take a census of the sons of Korah from among the sons of Levi, by their clans and their fathers' houses, from 30 years old up to 50 years old, all who can come on duty to do the work in the tent of meeting. This is the service of the sons of Kohath in the tent of meeting, the most holy things.
Well, then sometime after that, in David's time, David made a change to this entry level into Levitical service, and he dropped to 20 years old. And we read about that in 1 Chronicles 23:24.
These were the sons of Levi by their fathers' houses, and the heads of the fathers' houses. And they were listed according to the number of the names of the individuals from 20 years old and upward, who were to do the work of the service of the house of the Lord.
So as Zerubbabel and Joshua are coming back to Jerusalem now to rebuild the temple, they adopt this practice that David had in drafting these men who were 20 years older and having them supervise the rebuilding effort. Well, in the past, the Levites were tasked with the setup and takedown of the tabernacle. We get a brief description of that in Numbers 1, 50 and 51.
But appoint the Levites over the tabernacle of the testimony, and over all its furnishings, and over all that belongs to it. They are to carry the tabernacle and all its furnishings, and they shall take care of it, and shall come around the tabernacle. When the tabernacle is set out, the Levites shall take it down, and when the tabernacle is to be pitched, the Levites shall set it up. And if any outsider comes near, he shall be put to death.
So that's kind of an overview. There's a more detailed description of how the Levites were to put the temple up and then how they were to take it down and how they were to transport it as the people are wandering through the wilderness. But it was their responsibility to do that. In David's last days, he was making preparation for the new temple. God said that he wouldn't build it, but his son Solomon would build it. But David began to make some of the arrangements and set up some of the processes that were going to happen. And so as he was doing this, he appointed the Levites to oversee the work, just as was happening with the tabernacle, and we'll see again now. We read that in 1 Chronicles 23, 1 through 5.
When David was old and full of days, he made Solomon his son king over Israel. David assembled all the leaders of Israel and the priests and the Levites. The Levites, 30 years old and upward, were numbered, and The total was 38,000 men. 24,000 of these, David said, shall have charge of the work in the house of the Lord. 6,000 shall be officers and judges. 4,000 gatekeepers. And 4,000 shall offer praises to the Lord with the instruments that I have made for praise.
So they're going to supervise the work, but they've got quite a range of responsibilities there. There's some craftsmen there. There's some guys that are going to be like guards, it sounds like, protecting things. There are other people that are leading the worship and singing. So there's a lot of responsibilities that the Levites have here. Some were dealing with the acquisition of materials, guarding the materials, and then watching over the spiritual integrity of the work as well. And as we read, one group even is playing instruments and leading worship during this time. Well, the Levites are called on again for the rebuilding effort. These men were chosen to oversee the work. We don't read that they had any special expertise, as was listed when Solomon built the temple, but they had the required skills to supervise the effort. They were chosen because they knew the law and were the designated leaders of worship. So the emphasis here for them is a spiritual one. The temple would be rebuilt the right way. There were three groups, we read, that were going to lead the work. First was Joshua and his sons and brothers. And then there was a man named Kadmiel and his sons. And finally, there was a man named Henadad with his sons. And it says, and other Levites that would assist in the effort to oversee the building. Well, we're told about those who oversaw the construction in verse 9. And then in verse 10, the work was completed and the celebration began. We're not given any details about the processes of laying the foundation or how long it took to complete. That's because the focus is on the results of the project of the returned exiles, not so much the work itself, but what happened when it was completed. They had braved this long journey to get to Jerusalem. They established their own homes and crops. They gave freely and generously to fund the temple work. Many of them had worked diligently on laying the temple foundations. All this was done in accordance with the orders of King Cyrus. More importantly, all was done to follow the command of Yahweh, their God, with whom they had a covenant. And so there's a sense here that their covenant with God is alive again. The temple foundation was laid and the celebration began. Well, we see similar celebrations even in our day. Sometimes you'll see that there's a ceremony to lay the cornerstone of a building. We see this a lot of time with churches, and here's one example where there's a cornerstone. Now, when we talk about laying a cornerstone, it's really more of a symbolic element. It's not really a structural element to the building as it was back then for them, but often there'll be a place near the corner of a church where there's a plaque, or in this case, there's an actual stone that's put in the wall. So this idea of having this commemorative plaque or pausing to recognize the completion of a phase is something that we carry on even to this day. There might be some kind of a ceremony and people make speeches and maybe a prayer of dedication happens. Well, we also see something similar to this when there's some large building projects. A large building project may have what they call a topping out ceremony. And so the work on the building is stopped while the final beam is put in place. They put that last steel beam of the structure, and so the topping out ceremony recognizes that the building has been topped, the structure is in place. Obviously a lot more work to do in the building itself, but the work is halted while the structure is put in. And sometimes we see that there's an American flag on that beam, or there may be a tree on the beam. Sometimes it's painted a different color, as in this picture. Sometimes they'll get some of the workers to sign the beam, right, so that the workers are signifying that they've had a part in this construction project, so they allow them to do that. And then, of course, there are people that are there in suits to give speeches, and we praise the architect because he was brilliant and creative, and Somebody recognizes the people who financed the project. And then again, there's a celebration. Maybe they have a luncheon, and then everyone gets back to work again because there's still a lot more work to be done on the project. But they stop to celebrate this milestone in the project of topping out the building. And that's what's happening here with the Israelites as they complete the foundation. Obviously, a lot more work to do, but they want to pause and celebrate that milestone of completing the foundation. Yeah, I don't know if they were into yellow or not. So the returning exiles are pausing to recognize this milestone. It says the priests are dressed in their priestly garments, and we read about that. We talked about that last week, how they brought those garments with them, and we saw some examples of those. Well, now the priests are in their garments. They came forward. They've got trumpets. They're blowing the trumpets. It says the sons of Asaph had cymbals. Ezra writes that this was done in accordance with the directions that were given by David, and we read some of those earlier, how there was, I think Asaph was one of the players that came forth at David's time as well. Well, David established continuous worship before the Lord when he brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. We have some similarities there. He appointed the Levites, again, to minister before the Ark. And this is recorded for us in 1 Chronicles 16. So let's turn there. We won't read the whole chapter, but I'll read a few selected verses out of chapter 16. The first verse, and they brought in the ark of God and set it inside the tent that David had pitched for it, and they offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before God. And then if we skip down to verse 4, then he appointed some of the Levites as ministers before the ark of Yahweh to invoke, to thank, and to praise Yahweh, the God of Israel. And then let's read verses 6 and 7. And Benaiah and Jehaziel, the priests, were to blow trumpets regularly before the ark of the covenant of God. Then on that day, David first appointed that thanksgiving be sung to Yahweh by Asaph and his brothers. So here we see the overlap and similarities here, that Asaph is there with his brothers, and here in Ezra's time, we've got the sons of Asaph that are involved with the cymbals. So musical family there coming to and leading the worship. And let's just read a little bit into this section here, beginning in verse 8. I'll just read the first few verses just to give you a flavor of it, because I think these are some of the same kind of things that those worshipers were singing in Ezra's day. Oh, give thanks to Yahweh, call upon his name, make known his deeds among the peoples. Sing to him, sing praises to him, tell of all his wondrous works, glory in his holy name. Let the hearts of those who seek Yahweh rejoice. Seek Yahweh in his strength, seek his presence continually. Remember the wondrous works that he has done, his miracles and the judgments he uttered. O offspring of Israel, his servant, children of Jacob, his chosen ones. And it goes on from there. So that's what they sang in bringing the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem. I think there's some similar things going on there in Ezra's day. And then in that 16th chapter, 1 Chronicles, the section there from verse 8 on, there's a lot of that's actually captured in Psalm 105. So the first 15 verses of Psalm 105 repeat a lot of these words here. So it's memorialized there as well. David later prescribed something similar when giving Solomon instructions for building the temple where the ark would reside. So we see this repeated a number of times. Well, these are the things that the people are recalling from David, and now they're incorporating those things into their worship as the temple foundations are completed. Verse 11 says, they sang responsively, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever toward Israel. And we find these words in Psalm 136. This psalm is generally attributed to David, and it certainly fits this occasion of the dedication of the return of the ark and the building of Solomon's temple. It's a perfect responsive reading. So we're going to try to read a little of this responsively. So if you turn to Psalm 136, we'll pretend we're back in Ezra's day and we're reading responsively just as they did. And here's how we'll do this. We'll just go through like the first 9 verses. And I'll read the first part of the verse, and you're going to respond with the second part. And it's all the same for you. For his steadfast love endures forever. Okay, let's give this a try. We're here at the dedication of the foundation completion, okay? Give thanks to Yahweh, for he is good. Give thanks to the God of gods. Give thanks to the Lord of lords. To him alone does great wonders. To him who by understanding made the heavens. To him who spread out the earth above the waters. To him who made the great lights. To the sun to rule over the day. The moon and stars to rule over the night. I don't know, responsive reading, I think, is a lost art in the church. Growing up, we always had a responsive reading on Sunday mornings, and it wasn't as repetitive as this, but I don't know, there's something to be said for that, I think, in that participation. So that gives you just a little bit of a feel for maybe some of what was going on there as they read back and forth, they sang back and forth responsively, the Levites leading, and then the other people there responding to that in the way. So the leaders were acknowledging that Yahweh had again established his loving protection over the nation. The word love here in verse 11 is the word that's used for God's covenant love for his people. It exists forever. And now that worship was being reestablished, they recognized the commitment of God's unending covenantal love. Verse 11 goes on to describe the great excitement. The people shouted with a great shout. They praised the Lord that this great milestone had been reached. After all, he was the architect, and he was the one who had provided the financing for the project, so it was appropriate that they would pause and praise him. Well, now the foundation was laid. Verse 12 says that some of the older men had seen the previous temple and were remembering it. At that point, they must have been in their 80s or older for them to have a memory of that temple, because the temple was destroyed in 586. So for them to have seen it, been old enough to remember it, and now still be alive to see it again, they're quite elderly. And what they saw in this new foundation that was laid was in great contrast to the former temple. They saw a much smaller footprint. And as a result, they wept. Well, we read that others shouted aloud for joy. And verse 13 says that the wailing sounds and the joyful shouts were so loud that the people couldn't distinguish one from the other. So there's a lot of crying and joyful shouting, a lot of noise going on here. And it said the sound could be heard from a long way off. Well, let's make one last point here, and it comes out of these verses 12 and 13, and is this. God wants us to remember the past, but he doesn't want us to live in the past. So here's what I mean by that. The people could look back and they could remember how God had moved Cyrus to let them go and provide funding. God had protected them on their journey. God allowed them to reestablish their homes and their fields. He helped them locate the place of the altar and rebuild it. He had seen them through the procurement and delivery of materials and the securing of workers. Now, many people praised God as they reached this important milestone. These memories of what God had done spurred them on to praise and worship God. But another group could only look back in wishing and in sorrow. They were dwelling in the past, and they could only see what was lacking in the present. They mourned rather than rejoiced. They did not learn from the past, but they longed to be in the past and experience that. They wanted that feeling of pride that came from having a grand temple in which to worship. So they were disappointed when they saw this new footprint laid out. So God calls us to remember what he has done so that we may be encouraged and strengthened for our work today. Do you remember when God provided for you at a time when you were needy? Do you remember when God healed a loved one or repaired a broken relationship? Do you remember a weekend retreat that was filled with great worship and teaching from the Word? Well, we're not to long to relive that weekend or mourn that we don't have that experience now. We're to remember that God brought about those miraculous events in our lives, and he's still active today. The same Holy Spirit lives in our hearts to guide and provide for us today. He's there to encourage us in our Christian walk and ministry. The first 2 years back in Jerusalem were great for the people. But here we see the first indication that problems are brewing. Some people wanted to live in the past. That hindered their worship and their ministry. They were ungrateful for all God had done to them. What should have been a joyful time was only sorrow because they lived in the past, rather than expecting God to continue to do great things in a new way. Well, next time we'll see that the troubles deepen for them as the construction effort continues on. So let's talk about some application here. First of all, what do we see in these verses tonight about God or his character that we can focus on?